The manager's voice sliced through the hum of clinking glasses and soft jazz. "This is a classy place, not a kennel." A veteran stood frozen in the center of Delmont's bistro, his service dog beside him, surrounded by strangers who dared not intervene. Then he pulled out his phone, started recording, and with a calm, chilling certainty, asked the man to repeat those words. Within hours, the quiet humiliation would spark a nationwide firestorm, but what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. No pets allowed, even for heroes. The moment froze like a photograph held over an open flame. Faces turned, forks paused midair, tension hanging as thick as the scent of truffle oil and overcooked entitlement. Staff Sergeant David Carson stood still, the residual stiffness in his leg nothing compared to the cold spike settling in his chest. Gunner, attuned to his handler's pulse and posture, inched closer, his black coat glossy under the restaurant's diffused lighting, brown eyes flicking between David and the man in the tailored blazer. Scott, the manager, smug, polished, corporate, the kind of man who read customer satisfaction surveys but never the Constitution. David took a breath, measured, like he'd been taught back in Quantico when surrounded by chaos. "This is my service dog," he repeated, slower this time, his voice the restrained rumble of someone used to commanding a squad, not begging for a seat. "He's trained. He's legal. He's not going anywhere." Scott stepped forward, the sheen of his Italian loafers catching the light. "Look, I don't want a scene, okay? But you're making our other guests uncomfortable." David blinked slowly, the words settling like acid in his ears. Uncomfortable. Uncomfortable was crouching behind a Humvee while mortars screamed overhead. Uncomfortable was waking up 3 nights a week to the sound of his own voice yelling names of people who never made it back. Dining quietly with his dog wasn't uncomfortable. It was survival. "I came here to eat a meal," he said, jaw tight. "Not to be lectured on comfort by a man who's never seen the inside of a barracks." Someone coughed nervously. A waiter disappeared into the kitchen. A couple in a corner booth leaned closer, whispering behind a wine list. Scott's expression hardened. "You have 5 minutes to leave, or I'll have security escort you out." David didn't move. Not an inch. His hand found Gunner's collar, not to restrain, but to anchor himself. He felt the tremor beneath the Labrador's muscle, a shared understanding between 2 battle-scarred souls suddenly placed back on hostile ground. The silence returned, but this time it was different. Charged. Watching. A dozen pairs of eyes bearing witness not just to an argument over a table, but to the unraveling of something sacred. The unspoken contract that those who served would be respected. Protected. David reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the camera icon. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to beg. He was going to show the world what it looked like when a veteran was treated like a burden. You people think you're special just because you served. The temperature in Delmont's bistro seemed to drop a full 10 degrees. A dense silence settled over the room, broken only by the whine of a ceiling fan and the distant clink of silverware hurriedly being set down. David stood like bedrock, unmoving, expression unreadable, but his eyes tracked everything. The tension in Scott's jaw, the way the waitress recoiled after touching Gunner's leash, as if the dog had burned her, the hushed murmurs beginning to ripple outward from nearby tables. Scott's words hadn't just landed. They'd detonated. "This is a classy place, not a kennel." The sentence hung in the air, foul and thick like a sulfur cloud. It wasn't just condescension. It was venom. Targeted. Deliberate. A public stripping down of a man whose only crime was trying to have a meal with the creature that had kept him alive through more nights than anyone in that restaurant could imagine. David's hand didn't shake as he tapped record. He didn't flinch when Scott lunged forward, hand swatting at the phone like a toddler denied candy. The moment crystallized, Scott's mask of civility fracturing under the pressure of being challenged, his voice rising in volume but shrinking in legitimacy. Across the room, a busboy froze mid-step, a tray of crème brûlée trembling in his grip. A couple near the window exchanged wide-eyed glances. One woman lifted her own phone, instinctively documenting what she couldn't believe was unfolding in front of her salmon tartare. David's caption wasn't angry. It didn't have to be. It was cold, surgical, designed to cut deeper than any insult Scott had thrown. Denied service, harassed, because of my service dog. This is what respect for veterans looks like. He hit post. It was the modern equivalent of firing a flare into the night sky, an unmistakable signal to the world that something was wrong here, something that demanded to be seen, to be judged. And the world did see. Notifications began piling in before he even lowered the phone. Comments flooded in faster than he could read. This is disgusting. What restaurant is this? Name and shame. Where is this man? I'll pay for his meal. I served too. I've had enough. Scott's smugness evaporated, replaced by the pale sheen of a man who just realized the internet doesn't forget, and it definitely doesn't forgive. David didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to fight. He just needed the truth to speak louder than the insult. And it was. The core doesn't leave its own behind. The metal bench beneath David creaked slightly as he shifted, the cold biting through his jeans and settling into his knees. Gunner rested his head on David's boot, ears twitching with each engine that growled closer. The air had turned brittle, charged, not with fear, but with something older, heavier. Brotherhood, a promise carried not in words but in action. The first two to arrive said nothing, just parked, stepped out of a black Dodge Charger with a faded Semper Fi bumper sticker, and nodded. One was tall, red-bearded, with a tattoo sleeve that disappeared beneath his leather jacket. The other wore mirrored aviators, his left pant leg pinned neatly above a prosthetic. Both carried the same quiet gravity, the unmistakable air of men who had served in sandstorms and silence. Then came more. By the dozen, they came. Some on bikes, their engines snarling like old war dogs off their leash. Others in pickup trucks, the kind built to haul equipment and heartbreak, flying Marine Corps flags that snapped in the breeze like battle standards. USMC decals gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting back at the people watching from behind the bistro's tall glass windows. The effect was hypnotic. A slow, steady tide of steel and fury rolling in across the pavement, red and gold threading through gray Charleston skies. Inside, diners stopped mid-chew, forks frozen above porcelain. Cell phones began to buzz in unison, a digital chorus of shock and shame. The video played again and again. Scott, arrogant and dismissive, declaring his restaurant a place, not a kennel. But now, the context had changed. Now, those watching weren't just strangers. They were witnesses. Mike Callahan's boots crunched against the sidewalk as he approached, stocky, bulldog built, with a face that looked like it had once absorbed shrapnel and kept moving. His jacket was old leather, its stitching stretched across his back like a second skin. A silver eagle, globe, and anchor glinted near his heart. "You good, Staff Sergeant?" he asked, voice gravel and loyalty. David nodded once. The answer didn't matter. "Good," Callahan growled. He turned, scanning the rows of arriving vehicles. "Because we're not." That was all. No shouting, no threats. But the message echoed louder than any war cry. These men hadn't come to argue. They had come to remind the world that the Marine Corps didn't take kindly to one of its own being humiliated on home soil, and they sure as hell didn't leave their wounded outside in the cold. Semper Fi, mother. The transformation of Delmont's bistro wasn't loud. It wasn't violent, but it was absolute. 2 hours after David Carson had been shamed into leaving, the very space that had denied him dignity had been reclaimed, not with protest signs or slogans, but with presence. Silent, heavy, unwavering presence. Every table had a Marine at it. Every booth held 2 or more. There were no arguments, no speeches, just a sea of worn leather vests patched with unit insignias, polished boots dusted with red clay from Charleston's roads, and the quiet kind of steel in the eyes that comes from having stared down war and made it home. They didn't need to say a word. They were the statement. The floor manager tried to reassert control, pushing through the thickening crowd with the desperation of a man who'd realized the room was no longer his. "You can't just walk in here like—" He stopped cold. A silver-haired Marine in a black Stetson and Vietnam veteran, Pin, stepped forward. No anger, no threat. Just a calm, deliberate motion as he set down a small, dog-eared booklet on the hostess stand. The ADA Compliance Guidebook, opened to the page outlining legal protections for service animals. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The law spoke for him. Moments later, the heavy wooden door swung open again. This time, the heels that clicked against the tile weren't casual. They were ceremonial. Dress blues, polished brass. Sergeant Diana Reeves, shoulders squared, ribbons gleaming. Beside her walked a golden retriever in a crimson service vest, and no one said a damn thing. They parted for her like water around a warship. Then, through the center of the room came David. Jacket zipped halfway, cap still perched atop his close-cropped hair. Gunner padded beside him, tail calm, steps measured. Flanked on both sides by the Charleston veterans riders, David didn't walk in. He returned, like a man reclaiming ground stolen under the flag of ignorance. He sat at the same table where he'd been denied. Gunner curled obediently at his feet, sighing softly as if he too understood that this was more than a meal. It was a reckoning. A waitress approached. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, her voice a whisper laced with awe. "Would you like to see a menu, sir?" David met her eyes, then offered the kind of smile you give when you've fought for more than just yourself. "Yes, and maybe some water for my dog." A single clap rang out from the back. Then another, then 5. Then the room stood, a wave of sound rising like a drumbeat of justice long overdue. Civilians, veterans, young, old, a salute and applause. David didn't rise. He just sat, the noise washing over him like warm sunlight, Gunner's head against his boot, and whispered under his breath with a faint grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Semper Fi, Mother." Aftermath. Justice on the house. The apology came not with sincerity, but necessity. Delmont's Bistro posted it in muted Helvetica, white text on a navy background, the kind of design reserved for corporate contrition. "We deeply regret the events that transpired and sincerely apologize to Staff Sergeant David Carson and all veterans. The manager involved is no longer employed with us." It read like a confession drafted by attorneys and buried in a PR team's inbox until the storm grew too big to ignore. But it was too late for damage control. The video had detonated across platforms overnight, igniting a firestorm that algorithms couldn't suppress. Over 2.5 million views by morning. Tens of thousands of shares, comments, retweets. Veterans from Florida to Alaska posted their own stories of denial and disrespect, tagging the restaurant, tagging lawmakers. Hashtags like #ServiceDogRights and #Marines Don't Forget trended through the night like digital battle cries. By dawn, the story had metastasized beyond Charleston. Cable news anchors called it a national moment of reckoning. Think pieces bloomed across the internet. the forgotten code of honor. When civility meets combat boots. On the local level, something real shifted. State senators, once content to leave accessibility laws to federal oversight, began drafting emergency ordinances. ADA training was no longer optional in Charleston, it was mandatory. Delmont's, once proud of its exclusivity, became a cautionary tale. A high-end establishment turned into a meme. Yelp reviews flooded in, not with critiques of wine pairings, but odes to Gunner, to Sergeant Carson, to the men and women who took back the night with silence and unity. Yet David wasn't watching the coverage. He was home. The porch creaked beneath him, weathered wood singing soft and familiar as he leaned back into the chair he'd built after his last deployment. A chipped mug warmed his hand, coffee strong, black, just how he liked it. Gunner lay curled beneath him, his head resting against David's boot like a sentinel at ease, tail flicking with the occasional breeze. There was no smile on David's face, but peace. The kind that doesn't come from victory, but from something harder won. Acknowledgement. He hadn't demanded justice. He hadn't asked for a reckoning. But he got both. Delivered not with vengeance, but with quiet, disciplined force. The kind only a brotherhood forged in fire can summon. David sipped his coffee slowly, looked out across the tree line, and whispered to no one and everyone, Semper Fi.